Well, alrighty. I want to welcome you personally back to Justin Kopet's journey. Where have I been? What have I been up to? It has been a hectic, in a really good way, last couple of weeks. So, disclaimer. I want to start off by telling you that this title is essentially to prove a point to how the mind moves towards lower energy levels. So since this is a part 2 of essentially a series, and it's titled, I Hate You If This Is You, Part 2, essentially, I personally do not hate anyone. The very first part 1 of this series was essentially to draw one to figure out what their purpose is. And essentially, it's to prove a point to how the mind likes to move towards lower energy levels. So why I'm saying this is my top podcasts are, I felt so alone, I hate you if this is you, etc. And these are titled with lower energy levels. So some of the ways you can obviously map some of these things out as you focus, whether you know or are aware or aren't aware of the way that you're aware or not aware. Now, completely be open to the end of this episode because I have a lot of things that I want to cover of where I've been that can help you map out where you're going. So, again, with this being said, it is very important for you to understand the energy levels of consciousness, Dr. David Hawkins, levels of energy, Frederick Dodson. I encourage you to go look up these books, these audiobooks, listen to some of their content to understand and have a better idea of how I mean when speaking to you on these topics. So with the title being this, I think it definitely helps us understand the idea of one wearing a mask. Why? Because it essentially, underneath the mask, reveals the reasons that I'm broken in my own way, and say you might be broken in your own way, and there's a reason for that. Now, again, I went into kind of the idea of the mask in how essentially everyone is wearing a mask, and they pretend to not be wearing a mask, and there's a reason for them to obviously be the way that they are, just as I am. Now, with all of this being said, let's get down to business in terms of where I've been. So this title this episode really has nothing to do with the title. It's just to, again, draw you in and understand how you are attracted to, again, the lower levels of energy based off of the title of this episode. So I hope this is clear of why I titled it that way. Now, moving forward, where I was 2 weeks ago was I was on a seminar. I love seminars. With some of my favorite mental programming people, which is the Upgrade Clan. If you've seen their stuff or heard of their stuff or been around their stuff or haven't been around their stuff, go check out their stuff. Highly recommend it. Like I said, I am just a very curious individual. And how do I know these things work? Well, you never know until you apply them. And what we were doing was quite interesting. So many of you probably are aware of what the CIA is. A large intelligence organization. I can't even tell you what CIA stands for. However, you can obviously go and look that up. Now, who I was learning from over the past couple weekends, 2 weekends ago actually, was an individual by the name of David Morehouse. And who David Morehouse is he is an ex-military CIA operative who very much so understands the ability of the human psyche and the mind of what you and I are capable of. And some of these things that he spoke about where these things have been around since existence. And your tax dollars, my tax dollars, millions of them, have gone into understanding how this stuff works. And I'm going to go into how and what we were actually doing as we progress here. I just kind of want to set the background of who and what I was up to a few weekends ago. And for me, it's to understand how I can essentially put it into words. Because what we were doing is we were taking 8th dimensional data, transcribing it into 4th dimensional data, and then putting it on paper, which is 2-dimensional data. So what is the 8th dimension, you may ask? Well, he said there's 3 ways to describe it. There is your own thoughts in the 8th dimension. There is noise in the 8th dimension. And there is data in the 8th dimension. Now, another way to look at this might be is there are your own thoughts. There are evil thoughts. And there are the source thoughts. Now, one other perspective on this might be, again, your thoughts, good, evil. 3 ways to describe it. Now, I may be off on this. However, this is how I am personally understanding it. And why it is very important is essentially if we have had these abilities since the start, and then your tax dollars, my tax dollars, millions of them went into developing and understanding this, you think the CIA would go down a rabbit hole of something that's not even possible? I don't think so. And why I find it very interesting is my purpose, from my understanding, is to serve the Creator, to do God's work. Now, a friend just recently told me, he said, it doesn't really make sense how I'm here or why I'm here. And I honestly probably shouldn't even be here. But by the grace of God, I am here. And that really stood out to me because last weekend, I have this neuroscience protocol that I follow. And I ended up taking another trip. And if you're understanding how I mean by trip, you might begin to. Now, with this, for me, it's to look at it, things in a different perspective. Now, the way I see it as is, I necessarily don't believe in good and evil, a hot or cold, a yin or yang type of perspective. And here's why. The way I see it as, it's, yes, there is darkness. Maybe you could describe them as lower levels of energy that is around in the collective consciousness. And if you think of a dark room, right, with no lights, and you think of a light switch that has a dimmer on it, and if you were to scroll up on the dimmer, that essentially brings more light to the dark room. It's essentially changing the context around the idea. And what I mean by that is changing the context from one of my mentors, Chase, told us is very crucial. Because if we were to take the context of what he described to me as, it's like, if you were to think of, being in a mall, right? You're walking around a mall, it would be very unacceptable for you, and we're all safe and healthy, to obviously take off your clothes like you were going to get into a shower, right? Like that is way out of context. Nobody in their right mind would ever do something like that. Now, if we change the context of the situation to you or I being in a bathroom where it is acceptable because the shower's running and we're going to take a shower, changing the context in that situation would make that idea of taking off one's clothes to get in the shower to be acceptable. Now, you might be wondering, like, what does this have to do with anything and everything? Well, it's just about the idea of changing the context. And for me, it's to understand how I can take this data that I download that comes into my mind at 4th dimensional, and I'll be able to explain more of this stuff and how I understood it as I was learning it a couple weeks ago, and then transcribing it. this is not obviously transcribing it on paper. This is transcribing it through words, through the voice, through my words that are going with you as you listen to this podcast. Okay? And I believe it's very important for you to tune into the end so that way it can make full sense. So if my purpose is to serve the Creator, I understand that by the grace of God, I truly am here. Why? I don't know. How? Is because Jesus loves me. God loves me. And I do believe it is my purpose to serve the Creator wholeheartedly, which is why I love the verse Colossians 3:23. Work heartily for the Lord and not for man. In understanding that none of these things are mine, they have just been given to me by the Creator. My voice, my body, my mind, the trainings that I take, the things that I am attracted to in terms of learning, these are just things that connect with my purpose of who I am so I can serve the will of the Father. So I hope this can help you as you move forward on your journey and you focus for where you are going. Because for me, there's a lot of data that I was downloading. And as I move forward, it's one thing after another that helps me understand where I'm going. And like I say to you, I do believe I fully understand the purpose that I'm supposed to be moving towards, and that is to serve the Creator. So my purpose for this podcast is to transcribe the things that I learn for you to help you win in whatever way you're supposed to be winning at. I was playing golf the other day with some friends, and I was shooting okay. However, I really noticed that for me personally, it really did not come down to how I perceived my shot. What I really felt and found passionate was how the ones that I was with were shooting and how they were making the best of their shots. I wanted no more for them than to get a hole-in-one or to sink that 30-foot putt or to chip it in from the fairway. I felt very compassionate towards them in that situation. And I hope you're kind of understanding what I'm speaking about here. Because if you haven't listened to the past episodes, I would highly recommend that you go and listen to those past episodes. So with this 8th dimensional data, right? So what we were doing is, if you think of where you're at currently, it is a specific coordinate, number, location, data, area that you are in. Especially if you're watching this, I am in a specific room and it is a specific coordinate on a map that one can punch in their GPS and essentially be at. Now, what I want you to understand is if we took a big circle, say 20, 50, 100 miles, and went around where you're at, if you were to think of it on a 2-dimensional map, and if you're following me here, again, these are things that even when I was reading the Bible, I believe it was Moses, he would go into tents with many other individuals, and they would all have their own individual tent. This is exactly what I read after I was done doing this training on the flight home. And it was on Sunday, and I got in my scriptures, I got in my word, and I found it very interesting the way that the mirror of the world works. Now, what they were doing in the Bible, and I'll have to get the verse. I think it's Expodius. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. They were all in their tents, from the understanding of it. They each had their own specific tent. And then God would come down, and who would he speak to? He would speak to Moses. And through the collective, consciousness that essentially was there. They were gathering data. Now back to this idea of us gathering data in the 8th dimension. What we were doing was we had a coordinate where, again, if you took a 25-mile radius around where you're at and you look around and you see the different things that are there, how it works is obviously the light comes into the retina, which would be your eyeball, and then from there into the mind where the holographic idea of your reality becomes solid. Okay? Now, as you're following me here, we were at a Six Flags for one of the coordinates that we did in Louisiana. And we did it, about a 10 to 20 mile radius around it. And essentially what we were able to do without actually knowing where the coordinate was is when we went into the idea of this 8th dimension, we got data, which then came into our minds, which then we transcribed on a piece of paper. So if you think about it, you obviously have past memories, and you can understand those specific things, that were in the past that you can recall right now that come to mind as you think of what I'm speaking about to you in this very moment. And you could go ahead from the mind and write down those things that you were experiencing in the past. Now, with this was all present time. This was all present data. This was all in the present moment. Us as a collective group, there was about 10 to 15 of us, were all using the collective consciousness to map out this specific coordinate that we had no idea at the time was Six Flags in Louisiana that got flooded. And then we were taking that 8th dimensional data, deciphering between our own voices, the noise, and the data, or the source, not the source or our own voice. And we were then getting visual downloads, sensory acuity downloads, taste downloads, smell downloads, feeling downloads, touching downloads, all of these things. Textual, if I have not already mentioned that. Heat, the way the wind was, etc. And then we were then transcribing them on the piece of paper. And then from there, what we were doing, if you're following me here, and you focus on what I'm describing to you, again, it sounds very sci-fi-ic. However, why, again, would the CIA dump millions of your tax dollars into figuring something like this out and using it, obviously, for the good of humanity? Now, that is what I would encourage you to do this thing and use this information for. If you decide to jump into one of David's trainings or join Upgrade, either way, completely up to you. Now back to it. I found it very interesting. And why this is if we were to take the idea of changing the context of a situation, I kept hearing in our Bible studies to bind the enemy. And then when I went and I looked up the word bind, it means tie to. Right? So it's like, why would I want to tie to the enemy, right? That doesn't really make any sense. And again, as we change the context of the idea, and I thought this was a perfect example that my friend David then explained to me, was he was saying that bind, in the definition of the Bible, means to tie out the enemy, if that makes sense, to tie down the enemy, to not allow him in, right? Again, just changing the context of the word, of the definition, of the idea of good versus evil, right? If you were to follow me, and for me, I am working on being able to describe this so it makes perfect sense. Now, I don't know if you know or you don't know or you might know or have an idea of what I'm speaking about. However, as you continue to follow along, moving forward into the future and listen more to this podcast, I'm going to promise you I will make it make sense, because this stuff is very interesting. And why I want to say this is, what if you, as a person, if we were to think of your timeline, obviously you can think of the memories in the past. What if you were to have memories of the future, of who you are to be, tied in with your purpose of the will of the Father, of the one who has sent I and you to be here in this moment, and you knew moving forward in the future that through a decision tree of making decisions down a path of the timeline moving forward, as you move forward in life and you understand that you're going somewhere and that there is a purpose on your heart to where you are supposed to be heading. And if you knew how to then, if you knew how to then in the future, through the 8th dimension, understanding the difference between your own thoughts, the data, and the noise, and you could easily understand the data in the future of where you are heading, of who you deep down in your heart and soul know who you are to be, could then download that data. And from this moment of time, right here, right now, through a decision tree of the right decisions, and say you only made the right decisions moving forward, we're able to get to that purpose that is on your heart easily and effortlessly. Now, would that help you is what I want to know. Because I, as a person, feel very called to understand, to know how to use this as a tool and a resource to fully immerse myself into the purpose that the Creator has for me. Now, I don't know if you believe me, and that's good, because this is going to make you go out there and do your own research. There are CIA documents on this stuff that are released to the public. Now, that is for you to obviously go and do your research. And moving forward, I have it in my notes. I don't have it right on me right now, but I will get you some documents that David Morehouse shared with me. And the cool thing about David Morehouse is he is one of the very last individuals from this military branch that, again, this CIA dumped millions of your tax dollars into to understand how to use this information that has been around from the beginning of time. What I love about this is, how is Jesus Christ getting the downloads of his death? What did he know? Good question. How did he know that he was going to die on the cross? I understand that there was prophetic words before him. However, I do believe that he was seeing it in his own mind's eye before this actually occurred. And that is why right before they capture him, he was praying and asked the Father to make it so if there was any other way that he could fulfill the will of the Father besides going through this horrific death, that he would. Now, are these the right tools? Again, I am just a very curious student, and I am a student of life, and I take no credit for understanding these things. I, as a person, just feel called to understand how to utilize them to maximize my purposes and to fulfill the will of the one who sent me. Now, I get this is a little long-winded, and I hope this makes sense in your mind as it goes all the way down, because the way that I understand this, I hope it transmutes by osmosis through the collective consciousness to you. Now, there's a lot more to go into on the collective consciousness and how that works. And I do believe that is to be said for another time. Now, like I said, this has nothing to do with hating anyone. This only has to do with the idea of how lower levels of consciousness or lower levels of energy are attracted to this type of label that is on the podcast. And I would encourage you to go and start to understand these levels of energy so you can begin to maximize whatever your purpose is. Because there is no other thing inside me that feels called to tell you that I would love to see you maximize that purpose. All right? Now, if you got value out of this, really quick, before I go, please leave 5 stars now or, whenever the episode's over, or don't do it on the next one. Completely would appreciate that. And if you want to follow me, I am Justin Kopet on X. I am Justin Kopet on Instagram. Now, if you do have questions on this, and I would expect you to have questions, and if you made it this far, I would say just shoot me a message. I would love to understand what your feedback is, how you perceive this, what made sense, what doesn't make sense. Now, just because that's going to allow me to be more flexible in my communication. Because if I'm to be taking 8th dimensional data, taking it to 4th dimensions, and then transcribing it, however maybe words are 3-dimensional, it's not on paper. So I, as a person, want to serve you with a purpose. Now, all I have to say is thank you so very much for tuning into this one. I know it's a little long-winded, and I really hope this helps you. And I know it sounds a little bit out there, and that's why I would encourage you to go and do your own research. So, with that, if you have to rewind it, go do it. Otherwise, peace, my friends.